It's fine.
So Peter Harris is this phenomenal writer and poet who I had the pleasure of meeting last summer when we could all meet in 2019 in Valverde, which is a historically Black resort town outside of Los Angeles. It's pretty close to Cal Arts.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, it was a really magical event, a weekend where we just all hung out and it felt like instant family.
Mm.
And also a couple people said really strangely that it was like, oh, it's like the world ended and this is like our new community.
Mm.
Little did we
Well,
know.
my mother said, "Be careful what you ask for, or what you bring in, huh?"
Yep.
Yeah, and it was raining seriously that weekend too
It was.
for most. Yeah,
Yeah, it was
yeah,
cold. I mean, yeah, on paper it was miserable, but
yes,
yeah, it felt like
yeah.
heaven.
It was a beautiful experience. It was a great opportunity for us to take a deep breath, stand under a tree or something, and or a tent. I think somebody had a tent or something, no, like an awning. That's what it was.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, that was a marvelous meeting and a marvelous conversation. I still resonate on all that.
Yeah. Same here. Yeah, I feel like
Yeah.
just you and I spent like a whole day almost just talking
Mm-hmm.
about everything.
Yeah.
And it was really awesome.
Yeah. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
So we can continue today, whatever angles we want to take.
Yeah. Yeah, because in that year, um, I guess everything's changed and nothing's changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Highlighted and embossed, I like to say. This pandemic just kind of embossed things.
Hmm.
So, all the inequalities got embossed, the ugliness got embossed, but also, as I tried to personally grapple with right in the beginning, in the spring of 2020, as as a kind of a hermit in my own right, a quarantine in and of itself doesn't scare me or throw me off. I'm spending a lot of time writing and meditating and thinking anyway with this work I'm doing. But I remember at the beginning of the California lockdown, how important it seemed to me to put my finger on the seams of it all through the lens of poetry by different kinds of folk. Um, so I remember the blog post I wrote at that time really talked about how I was grappling with making sure that I didn't let anything seep into me, being scared, being paralyzed. And I remember as a result, I usually try to write no more than 500 to 1,000 words. But I think I let that thing go about 2,000 plus words just to make sure I got my sense of bearings as that unfolding began, the pandemic's unfolding began. And also, I wanted to make sure I said to myself something I could look back on and say, well, are you claiming affirmation? Are you really saying that something like this has never happened before? No, of course it had, because if you do any homework, biological warfare, among other things, or even just literally the encounter between indigenous folks here and European Americans in particular, even if it wasn't straight out genocide, which it was, but even if it was just an encounter where new germs and new organisms came into people's lives who had not been exposed to those organisms, there would have been change, but it did happen. And people, I wanted to make sure I kept a historical perspective as the pandemic sort of reared its head. And so even now, I still work hard to make sure I think about as much life affirming stuff and work for as much life affirming stuff as I can.
Yeah, I'll have to
Yeah,
go back and read that one. That sounds.
yeah, yeah.
I. It keeps occurring to me. I appreciate what you said about our uh, our genocide in the U.S. and it keeps occurring to me that that the pandemic, in conjunction with the resurgence of our Black Lives Matter protests, it's almost like a layering of just the fact that the virus doesn't discriminate the way that everything else does, and
Mm-hmm,
um but it's the same for all of these other institutionalized forms of violence that it we I mean organizers have been saying this forever, but it affects everyone, like racism
mm-hmm,
is not great for white people either. It's,
mm-hmm,
homophobia isn't good
mm-hmm,
for straight people, so on and so on.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and,
mm-hmm.
and trying to figure out, yeah, in a lot of ways it feels like a really needed reckoning.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad to plunge in like this. One of the things that's come to me this year in particular is I'm on like this real serious, sort of passionate drive to avoid becoming glib. I think social media, which is just another tool to me, but I do think that sort of at its worst, people can sort of quote unquote win by being really glib. And the more glib you are, the more catchy. So there's great glibness, I guess, Black Lives Matter and other hashtags that have represented something humane and hardworking. But what I'm trying to actually kind of grapple with is making sure that whatever approach to life and living that, particularly at this season in my life, I'm trying to really, really bring into sharpness and focus, is that it's not glib, that I'm not just saying, well, if you just do this, everything will be blah, blah, blah. Frankly, I've always, just temperamentally and professionally trained as a reporter and a journalist and a newspaper person. And my old professor, Sam Yet, used to say, he used to warn us. He says, you can't take notes if you're applauding people, or applauding ideas or ideology. And I always took that to heart. And so I think fundamentally, I'm not interested in easy stuff or fixes or sort of quick quip, collaboration by quip, so to speak.
mhm.
I do believe in the eloquence or the virtuosity that comes with people talking after deep listening, deep studying, and lots of times the brain is sort of doing background work so that when you do stuff like what we're doing here, yeah, or you're in the middle of a crisis or you're observing society's, evolution, you can in fact, come up with a turn of phrase that on one level, just kind of contracts and compresses things into what needs to be said. Uh, what often happens, and I think even with Black joy and these types of terminologies, if we aren't careful, they also will just become a glib cliche, because it really, for me at least, and I do connect this with the way you introduced me, you know, um, sometimes you have to just sort of get quiet and listen to somebody. I mean, one of the great memories I have of our exchange at the beginning, back in the spring of last year, was how deeply you listened. And I've tried sort of to mirror that, because there was so much interesting, the themes that we were talking about were so beautifully, so they were like mesmerizing. We were talking about, I mean, I still am in awe of a story you told me about when you went to like scuba diving or something, and you were underwater, and there was just a moment of understanding. I mean, so I think that, I guess I'm just sort of saying as we start that, I'm down for wherever we go with this, but fundamentally, you're catching me in a phase of life where I'm really grappling to find language that I think, or I hope, can contribute to breaking circuits between easy, stuff, just quips. I mean, even if you're right, I want the second and third and fourth beat to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing, because that's pretty much why I really wanted to talk to you also, because I loved when you were you told me about CU
Hmm.
when we met, and it's been really lovely to watch on Instagram and email updates about where that project is going, and um, sharing this history of Black men and being joyful, which is underrepresented, as you said,
Hmm.
an endangered species, or
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
and it just seems like it's more and more relevant as we're moving forward, and also it gets really tricky. Like everything that you just said is like um, what I what I keep thinking, and where this year has brought me is such a vast spectrum.
Hmm.
Um, on the one hand, I've gotten to fulfill a lot of long, like childhood dreams of home ownership, um, and restoring land, and being a part of a historically Black community, and all of these things. Um, and then on the other hand, coming to it from trauma, which is where I think a lot of us are, is and I the thing that keeps coming up is like, in my mind, um I keep thinking about how joy gets co-opted,
Yes.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
how systems of oppression a lot of times will use joy as like an easy out, to
Hmm. Hmm.
point at it and say, well, none of this must have been very terrible then, if
Yes.
so it's like
Yes.
that that messaging that I think is really helpful sometimes, and I've been told a lot of, is like, the best revenge is a life well lived, and all that stuff. um on some levels is really helpful, and on others I feel like uh nervous about it. Like
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I don't want to show certain people that I am happy right now. I want them to, and it's
Hmm.
also, there's been plenty of days where I certainly am not filled with joy, and I am
Hmm.
holding myself tenderly, or uh, so
Hmm.
yeah. So that's why I just felt I think of you often, and I know that you are already thinking of it on all these levels, and and that's what I really wanted to.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really want to plunge right into that, because so one of the things that I grappled with very early was, I started formally my Black Man of Happiness project 10 years ago, actually. That's when I genuinely realized I had a mission, so to speak, to convert or craft into a project that would provide an umbrella for my own cultural work on the theme of Black man and happiness. I was sort of inspired by this question: what is a happy Black man? And I saw the umbrella as a way to cover, to provide a canopy for community engagement work, where I could literally go out among men and interview them or talk to them or circle up with them and ask that question, but not try to tell them what I thought the answer was to that question, but to actually listen. And so I'm really grappling now with I finally got it, that, my orientation for this work is not to come at people as an expert, but to come as a participant, a full participant. And so when I'm by myself and in meditation, or if I'm writing, then it's really I have my own expertise as well, and I claim it. So I'm listening, I'm reading, I'm studying, I'm getting it wrong, or miraculously finding great turns of phrase that really capture for me, and the messages and the lessons that I want to capture as a storyteller, and get them down, get them into publications, get them into poems, or get them into like this upcoming anthology that's to make sure people know one of your photographs is in it. So, and that anthology is a way for me to, quote unquote, prove that there is a history of African American and Black male interior freedom, and that freedom, allows for us to stay happy, but not happy-go-lucky. That's always been the point I've wanted to make to anybody. So whenever anybody says, basically, bro, well, how you gonna be talking about happiness in the midst of all this stuff, the history alone? And I say, well, I'm not talking about some sort of one note clicking of the heels. That's not happiness to me. That's basically being happy-go-lucky. And then I also, very, very early on, I also tied all of this, for me at least, within the context of, the era when Thomas Jefferson and them were legally owning people, but yet with hubris, writing about the pursuit of happiness as an unalienable right and all that stuff. So I just go right to the crux of the stuff, the paradoxes, the hypocrisies. And I say that, you can't help where you're born and what time you're born and in what status you're born, but you can work diligently and rigorously and relentlessly on contributing to better outcomes, better social configurations. And yes, part of the social configuration in our culture includes stuff getting bought up and co-opted. It just does. I mean, and frankly, part of the proof of concept publication that we're working on, it includes your beautiful photograph. I'm using it as much to attract a literary agent, because I realize that after 10 years, and plus the years I've worked as a parent and as a grandparent and as a cultural worker, that, I'm at a phase where a few more resources could help do the work that I need to get done. So if I want to scale into that type of level, I have to get a literary agent, or I have to get a larger press behind the book. I'm not worried about proving that I can do the work, but once we sort of look at where there are opportunities to, angle in and maybe at least compete with the commodity stuff, or to neutralize, or to engage with it, or to. And the great thing about not having an either or mentality, I have more of a rites of passage framework for me. It doesn't really matter if anybody's doing anything around African American humanity that's for the good. Check. They just get a thumbs up from me. And you know, as we continue to grow or evolve or discuss or debate, I'm more than happy to see where the lightweight energies might be, and learn from them. Even sometimes that's where a nice turn of phrase, you know, where in my heart I call it glibness, but in fact it may help me, you know, if I collaborate with the right people, get on into forums where I can add my voice and the weight and or the substance of what I think I'm doing to the big conversation. So yeah, it's a full participation, I think, is what helps me stay fluid and flexible and supple as a part of the conversation.
Mhm. Yeah. That reminds me of one of I I I finished out this semester teaching for Interlochen. It was really strange timing, as most of this year has been, but it was the week before the election, and they asked me to take over two sections of the history of race and racism in America, and so I was like, oh, that's a really huge, especially
No
at this
question.
moment. Um, but the students were amazing, and one of the things, they're really active and passionate and angry for all the right reasons. And we were talking about SNCC and um, and comparing and contrasting social movements. And I was sharing with them a bit about my work um, with in protest, and one of the students jumped in and was like, well, what do we do knowing that like all none of these things worked?
Mm, mm,
At first I was like,
mm,
I felt myself get really defensive, and I know that
right.
that answer also is not really seeing all the places where things did work. But
Mhm,
later I was thinking about my defensiveness and and um our own like romanticization of our work, and how we almost, for me, like I feel like a lot of it is that we have to feel like we've done something.
mhm, mhm.
And I just love that you said how you said to try and stay in that place of failure, of knowing that you can mess up, and
Mhm,
being able to see it. And because I think if we uh if we feel like we did, everything right, then what are we going to do next? And
right.
obviously there's still a lot of work to do, so something, even if it was
Mhm,
on the right track, it has to, something has to either continue or
mhm,
adjust or yeah.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you do look at things as linear as a lot of us do, you know, you can see, victory or defeat, or you know what happens. You know, eh, the more the wiser we get, the more we realize how much the most important thing is, you know, framing things so that you can live a full whole life. You know, you know, I remember when I was at Howard many years ago, and I wasn't even an activist or anything. And frankly, I played shortstop for the baseball team, but I was a journalist and I was working for the student newspaper. It's called Hilltop. And, I remember reading an article about a guy in Chicago, Hakeem Madhubuti, who was on campus in those days as a writer in residence. And he said something to the fact that, you got to know what you're working for as much as you know what you're working against. And it struck me. And again, I wasn't particularly active. I just was aware and trying to learn and grow. And, at Howard, we were meeting people from Ethiopia and South Africa and Ghana and Nigeria and the Caribbean and South America. And, it was opening me up. I was just a young boy from Southeast DC trying to get hold of life, But I do recall Haki's, resonant turn of phrase, because it has helped me, as I said, if you look at things as a rite of passage. Now, there are certain moments when you're definitely trying to win. I mean, but if you configure the world as heroes and enemies and right and wrong in very direct contrast or contrasting ways, yeah, there are moments in history where you got to win, and you want a victory. You want to see. I think for me, the biggest current hunger and desire, especially as I sort of watch the struggle in LA County to push back against prison building, to reallocate billions of dollars of our money into more humane, preventive ways of dealing with everything, the outcomes of poverty and racism, et cetera. I mean, that's a victory that actually is being won. I voted for the proposition, that won, so that the LA County Board of Supervisors, has to do X, Y, and Z. Now, the key thing for me, and what is that this whole idea of why joy, why happiness, why should that even be a part of the menu? Well, because if you live a whole life, you're even, you can't just quote unquote stay strong in the struggle, because the struggle is for what? It's for protecting the majority, of the citizenry. It's for democratically controlling and allocating the commons so that people don't have to be poor. They don't have to be locked up all what I mean? All the stuff that we fight literally against. But what's the framework in which we're rumbling? So when Haki said, make sure you know what you're fighting for as much as you know what you're fighting against, that really struck me. And, again, I'm actually not, I don't consider myself, a friend of mine asked me years ago when I was younger, even, he said, do you consider yourself a revolutionary? I said, well, actually, no, I have a job. You know what I mean? I go to a job every day. And at that time I was going through a divorce. I was raising my son and trying to, build a lot. I said, what I was really resisting was a sort of all-in-one word that captured what I wanted to, the life I wanted to live, which is to live a whole life dedicated to something beyond, taking advantage of somebody, owning somebody, stealing from somebody, etc. So I don't know. I get. So I think when I hear you say what your student said, it's glib to say things didn't work, or because there wasn't a complete radical overhaul of a particular society. That's glib, because I'm down here as we speak. I'm in Florida, and when I take walks down here as I get to know the region, and I live near Eatonsville, where Zora Neale Hurston was raised. and you see the swamps, and you see the lushness of something like the Everglades, and you know people actually lived in those settings and crafted society out of those settings when they ran away from the so-called civilization. Uh, when you really see how hard it is to build a society that's genuinely like generous and looks out for society citizens, and you come and you want to get take a line from that era to this era, you gotta be wise enough to acknowledge healthy change. It's just that nothing is static about this thing. You know, you can have a victory. You talk about SNCC, you know, they had victories. They went into counties where, you know, European Americans at that time were the minority with weaponry and were terrorists. And those young people went in those communities and they said to the elders who already were hip and wise, they just needed to, like all of us, sometimes you just need new energy, a person like a Stokely or Miss Baker, or, you know, all the folks who we remember from that time frame, to just sort of come in and say, I'm with you. And by the way, just as a reminder, here's a strategy that might work for this time. And this is how it's connected to what's happening over in this state and up in here. And this is what, you know, the preachers and their allies are doing. So you just sort of end up stitching stuff together. And it becomes, I think for me at least, a lot richer. It's like a life lived as opposed to just a bunch of reactions to ugliness, to racism, to white supremacy. All that stuff is critical. But I'll just end this way, Liddy. You know, again, back to Howard days. You know, when I was reading the early stuff by Francis Welsing and Neely Fuller and them on white supremacy, you know, it kind of came to me. You know, Dr. Welsing was a psychiatrist, and so she was making a real assertion, a real diagnosis, and she was saying like white supremacy is an illness. And so I'm saying later on in my life, well, wait a minute, if that's true, then like any chronic, when you're dealing with any chronic illness, you want to inoculate yourself against it. You don't want to live the rest of your life enthralled to it, you know, and that has been a super breakthrough for me. So anyway, those are some of the things that come to me as I hear what you were saying about the teaching experience and the responses you were getting.
Yeah. No, I definitely and we talked it through and recognized that you can't judge, you know, hundreds of years of struggle that way. But
Wow, nice. Yeah.
but um but it's still too, I mean, it just, to me, it really spoke to like how uh where I was kind of getting um frozen myself
Mm.
and trying, I think it has something to do with the amount of resistance you're involved in, or at least for me, like the more work that I put in, the more that I want to believe that something's, you know, that something is had an effect.
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and I know there are, you know, solid things that we can point to, as you're saying, like having having votes on the ballot isn't a solid signifier, but at the same time, just being able to have like an internal um, check and balance,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and not getting too comfortable, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
but also, I guess uh, a few other people came to mind as you were talking, and one of them, Chris Hedges, often says
Mm-hmm.
that you don't you don't fight fascists because you're going to win. You fight fascists because they're fascists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've been listening to a lot of his talks, and also Cornell West, and so Cornell West is always reminding people of like starting from the place of your own moral integrity and working out from there, that we can't do these things for any sort of outcome, or Angela Davis talking about the overarching bend of struggle, and how she doesn't expect, to end racism in her lifetime, but like
Mm-hmm.
contribute to its end requires this enormous effort. um
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
but I feel like too, it links so well with the idea of your work, um
Mm.
because there definitely needs to be um those moments of joy in recognition of the work that we have done, so that you can like restore your reserve
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to keep going,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yes.
It's definitely, but as you were saying, it's not like a stagnant point of arrival, that it's like
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, it's not, joy is not cheap.
No way. Yeah, nothing, nothing. Also, I talked a little bit about not being linear, but what I really want to say is, again, what I'm for is a kind of a sense of respect for increments, for baby steps, for pulse, for breath. Um, and this is why I say, for me, again, and honestly, Lydia, I don't come at this with 5 checkpoints for how to be happy. I just don't. Um, but I do think that what's important is to honor integrity. And so if you really do, let's say I'm a younger person, I really think of myself as an activist or a revolutionary or whatever terminology that captures my social justice or my moral stance in human rights work. Um, well, for me, the first fundamental integrity is simply, you know, seeing with your own eyes, interpreting with your own mind. You know, I'll try to make a point as it relates to the book that I'm working on now. So the book's called "See You: Faces of the Black Man of Happiness." Actually, it's "See You: Emanating a Sense of Joy," and it's from a campaign that I call "Faces of the Black Man of Happiness." Um, and so at every moment, as we've been sort of unearthing historical photos, we've just looked for what strikes us as a joyful moment in time, a sense of happiness. You know, before my colleague, a research librarian, a younger colleague, her name is Helen Kate, before she coined that term, emanating a sense of joy, and she was really just starting her letter on my behalf uh, to try to see if the Library of Congress or librarians at the archives or elsewhere. She says, I got a patron here. He's looking for photographs of black men and boys. And she said, emanating a sense of joy. And I said, what? I kept saying, like, look for happy black men, look for smiley black men. Well, I couldn't come up until she came up. So what that phrase has done and framed for me as the curator / cultural worker, right in the crux of it all, is it was like an exhale. So now, let's talk about the photograph that you've let me include in the book. It's a beautiful picture it's a character, as you've described it. We'll let people see it when it comes out, but it's a beautiful photo of a dancer stretched full out on a sand dune. And it's this brother, it's this dark-skinned black man, but he's not smiling. He's not, tap dancing. There's certainly nothing happy-go-lucky about the gesture. It's just emanating gorgeousness. First, he's a beautiful cat. Secondly, the way you framed everything, it just puts a person in a framework. And I spent a lot of time. I just finished an essay that will come out in sometime in 2021. And there's an old poem by and fiddle with So there you go. I just kept on talking while you was going.
Hotspot overheated.
What'd you say?
My hotspot overheated. Oh man.
Oh, okay.
I could tell you were on a roll too.
It's all good. You'll see if I made any sense or not when you listen back to it.
Okay. I hope it kept recording.
It looked like it did.
Okay, great. I lost you at you said a poem. But...
Yes, I was talking about Gwendolyn Brooks's poem. The crux of it is first fight, then fiddle. And when I read that, I was like, oh, yeah, right. You don't have time in the struggle to be beautiful. Or to, well, as I've grown and wised up, it came to me to invert that a little bit and say, fiddle while you're fighting. Fiddle while you're fighting. Fiddle with joy. Fiddle with the system even. Fiddle can take on another meaning too, beyond the use of fiddle as a violin. When you fiddle with something, that means you're tinkering, you're recrafting, you're rewiring. Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, I was saying, in the midst of struggle doesn't mean you have to suddenly go completely ascetic. That's not how I understand African-American culture and African diaspora culture. We don't go ascetic, we go full out. So we're singing, even while we're running away, we singing. We're quilting to suggest the direction to the safe house. We're, as I said earlier, Sweet Honey in the Rock, singing all about absolute freedom as best we can describe it, but with the most gorgeous harmonies. So I really, I think if any message for sort of the close of this year, as we're poised for 2021, any message that I want to give is I'm really working on staying supple, respectful of pulse and pulsation and wave and, in and out, and the sort of the earth orbits, it rotates and it wobbles, all at the same time. So I'm really, the happiness work for me, first and foremost, and actually for the most part, is to stay happy for myself. So that when I go to Val Verde, I can stay curious. I only really knew one person, the person who invited me up there, Skyra. I didn't know that you were going to be there, or that other writers or other, like the guy who has the farm out in the desert, where you had your, where you had parked your, the thing that those Silver Street Airstreams, all that stuff. But when I said yes to Skyra, I said I'm coming up there. I said, girl, I don't have no tents. I'm an urban dude. I gotta have you. So she said, I got you. We got you. And it was dry and everything in there. But when I went up there, to participate fully. And I didn't stress the timing. I didn't say, girl, what I'm supposed to read? I got to go home. I got off of all of that calendar, all that schedule. She would check in with me and she said, oh, we're almost there. I said, sis, it's fine. I'm here. And then I learned about your work, the Black in the Water excerpt that you had. And I said, well, who did this? She said, she's right over there, which led to our conversation, which leads to what we're doing now. So I'm really, really serious about this linkages, just doing the life with full participation. It'll get you where you need to be, so.
I really appreciate you. That also, this all also reminds me of, you mentioned South Africa and interacting with people there from at Howard. And I had the honor to meet Desmond Tutu, and his one of the things that stuck with me is the way that he taught the difference between peace as we understand it in the US and peace as they understand it in South Africa, or at least within the movement at South Africa. And so he told us about restorative justice as their understanding of peace. That you can't have a stagnant peace as we often think of it in the US, of like no one's doing anything. And there it's like required to get through, to like work through all of these barriers to, you could say, like, to happiness and joy in order to have peace. Like you can't just keep your mouth shut.
Yes, I think that as I study this more, I'm not suggesting a kind of a laissez-faire definition that, your individuality is so prime that you get to do anything and everything you want. I think, as I was reading your year-end note about how you're living on the sacred ground of Idlewild, and 20 minutes or so of a drive, I guess, from where you are the very people who are talking about, if I got to wear a mask, I'm not free, or I'll take some guns and go, threaten the legislature or try to kidnap a governor. That's not happiness to me. Yeah, and certainly when as soon as you contextualize stuff, so if you say, all right, you got 40 white dudes in fatigues with automatic weapons, standing in the face of guards in the Michigan legislature, as soon as it's defined as that thing, that's not any kind of happiness. That's literally a continuation of white terrorism and white, supremacy as a motivation for undermining everything, democracy, safety, any other ways you want to put it. And if you're talking about, if you want to add in everything, I mean, you're going to kidnap a governor, a female governor of a state duly elected. Well, would you have done that to Governor Romney back in the 60s? You know what I mean? Would you have even thought of that? So, yeah, I'm not talking about anything but an ethical participation in society that calls out the bullshit like that stands against it. I mean, we're talking days after I read that, the feds are not going to prosecute the guy who rolls up on the young man in Cleveland and shoots him. There is, the work that needs to be done is indeed, it's literally overwhelming. And so you do what you can do. I'm not a silver spooner. I'm not born into money or access or entree. Uh, I haven't gotten a pardon for anything. You know what I mean? I'm not going to get a pardon, because I'm, allying myself, with somebody like Trump and his ilk. So what do we have at our disposal? We have, everything from a life well lived to true, study of how society works and doesn't work. And we have allyships, alliances that we can build, and we do have to stay aware, and we do have to listen, and we can't demonize white people, for example, because of white supremacists or because of the 1%, sort of dark money moguls, and you got to really find an individuality that's grounded on integrity, which is the word I think we were talking about earlier. So this is what we're doing. We're living a life here, and everything happens at the same time. Everything happens at the same time.
Yeah, I love the choice to stick with emanating, because I think that's the part that it gets to the deeper, like the restorative practice, the restorative
Yes.
piece versus just as you were saying, the surface, the superficial performative. Right. And yeah, I'm just hoping that that I can keep a good balance here. And
yes, that's the struggle. That is the struggle. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm one of the things I am really joyful about is the people like you in my life who I can work through these things with, and really grapple in a safe way, Yeah.
Well, and back at you, one of the things that struck me when we met, and as I've studied some of your work, and is this love of nature and science that you have. So you've literally shot film in the ocean and in forests, and that moves me because, one, it sounds fascinating and hard work, no doubt, but it's just that perspective, that includes the fullness of creation, even. You know what I mean? And I feel, it keeps you both like humbled, because if you go in certain places like the ocean, you ain't at the apex no more of things. Although we talk deeply about sharks and how sharks get sort of stereotyped and all of that. So I'm still, but I can't remember verbatim everything we said, but that was one of the most welcome, and expansive conversations I'd had in a long time. So I just feel like it's important to encourage people to see everything as a possible tool for a form of liberation. And I don't mean this in a glib way. I truly do. I truly mean this in a way that says, well, if you are into a thing, I know sculptors, I know artists and all that typical, but I also know chefs, and I know people who, I know a guy who's a woodworker extraordinaire. I mean, when he's working on wood, it just changes the world. And I think of other writers like, Wendell Berry and other people who talk very, very reverently about work and about, dynamic, what I call dynamic silences, communion with the all, communion with nature. I mean, it's important for me as a person doing the work that I have been crafting to see myself as part of something whole. So that, and then suddenly, this next year, at least one book will be published. I'll publish one myself, which includes the photographs we're talking about. Another Chicano brother down in Texas is publishing a book of love and erotic poetry. And I make it absolutely critical that wholeness includes love. Wholeness includes sensuality and erotica and touch and pleasure. I'm in conversation somewhere else. We're trying to get a book of poems published. I mean, so I feel like not in this sort of production driven way, but I have been very productive because I'm moved by the work. When I sit down and write the poems now, it's not just so they can get published, it's so I can have a communion with language. That's a way better and way richer. That lets me know I'll be doing this for the rest of my life. When I was younger, it was all about, I got to finish this poem. I got to try to get it published. Or if I met a writer or a fellow writer or somebody I was competing with, I always was saying, yeah, man, what you working on, man? What you working on? I'm working on this, man. Oh, I just got published here. I've been published since the 70s. Cool. So it's great. It's fine. Maybe it'll help me get a grant one day. But in terms of doing this work and the work that we're talking about and the work that I admire you doing, I mean, wow. I mean, like literally just looking at the color behind you, what it says to me is that you are in communion with that living space. Because I'm not a painter. I know you can do all these things, but I'm like literally looking at how just tender this, the blue is right up against the wood and there's the pink flowers, all that stuff. To me, that's a life of engagement. And that's the life I'm trying to live.
That's really beautiful. I actually, I have always been in love with plants also, and I've just been falling in love with them more and more. And these last couple years, like since I've had a bit more stability in my living situation, I've collected, I think I'm pushing 80 houseplants. And
nice.
And like you were just saying, one of the things people, because also with the pandemic too, and millennials in particular, it's become like a pretty big trend is like house plants and plant culture. And so all these people are like, oh, you could like start selling them and like propagating and, whatever, do a YouTube plant, whatever.
Right.
And just the idea of it, like I started a plant library at the Fine Arts Work Center for the fellows that were visiting, and that was amazing. But the idea of
wow,
of starting it as when you turn it into, this is what I need to survive. It suddenly feels not as joyful.
Yes, yeah, I see your point.
Yeah.
Because in fact, what you're doing is giving yourself breath. As you probably, make sure I'm getting this right, but my understanding is that we exhale carbon dioxide, plants inhale it and exhale oxygen.
Yeah.
So you flooding, and how much of beyond the physical and factual, think of the metaphor in a time when people are dying because they can't breathe. I mean, I think of the marvelous poem by Ross Gay, where right after Mr. Garner was murdered and choked, and he talked about how Mr. Garner was a gardener at one point. And the whole poem culminates to the line that he spoke in the midst of being suffocated. But I think of how critical how that poem went beyond protests to literally embracing Mr. Garner as a creature of the world, as a creature of the land, as a cultivator of beauty and breath. And I think that that's what is super, super important right now for me. Um, so when I say I see you to a cat in these photographs, um, and it means something more than just the surface. It also is vernacular too. When I was growing up, if you said, "Yeah, man, I see you, man, I see you," that means that you have acknowledged not only the humanity, maybe their style you're digging or envious of or whatever. So I'm all for the blending, the braiding, the double dutching of vernacular to depth thinking and psychology. uh, if brain research, we now know that when we smile, the brain is saying, yeah, cool, keep it up. It releases endorphins in your body. Now, that doesn't mean you should be, well, you could, but I'm saying if you're smiling and somebody trying to blow your brains out, that's a different context. So you may need to also smile while you're kicking ass, or smile while you're running or shooting back, or whatever the range of things that might have to happen. So again, I don't want to sound glib, but I do want to embrace that, we are part of nature. We are part of the all, so to speak. And, if you embrace your fullness, your wholeness, then you realize what you're fighting for, as Hockey reminded me back in the day. And that's what I want to keep my focus on, my eye on the prize to see. Because if you don't, you ask the question like the student asked, well, how does it feel to know you failed? Well, that's glib to me. And even if it's frustration driving that, even if the person is smart and well-read and gets it and is critiquing, various philosophies or various strategies that people use. But one of the things I want to say before, however we resolve this, I do want to say this about, since you mentioned SNCC at the beginning of this. So even though I feel totally like inspired by this happiness work, I have my own doubts about its value sometimes. And so I remember right after former President Clinton sort of took a swipe at Stokely Carmichael, how disrespectful was that at a funeral, John Lewis's funeral. He starts just saying, isn't it great that SNCC actually, chose, um, or maybe didn't quite get, let me revisit. He just dissed Carmichael as if his way of life, Stokely Carmichael, his way of life was radically different from John Lewis's. Sort of looking back from the 80-some-year-old John Lewis all the way back to the South in the 60s. Well, right after that, I started seeing photos of Carmichael, who went on to change his name to Kwame Ture, of course. So he's sitting on this porch with this older African-American man, and they're holding each other's hands. Stokely's sitting on the edge of this porch, and they're both laughing their asses off. And I had never seen this photograph before, but when I found it, it's like it was a gift to me. It was as if someone handed it to me and said, "Here is your emblem, almost your prism through which to answer why you think happiness and joy are valuable to human rights work." Because so we did research. I went through SNCC. I couldn't find any citation on the photo. I went to SNCC websites, civil rights websites. I know elders who were in the movement. I wrote them. They didn't know who had taken the picture. So ultimately we found the picture. We found the photographer. We got permission. We found out who the guy was Mr. Carmichael was sitting on the porch with, none of which nobody knew. So I'm like, first, I'm thrilled as a reporter to have found all of that. But so I'm seeing this picture and I'm saying, in the midst of this voting rights campaign, 1965, in Lowndes County, Alabama, where total violence surrounded Black people, Now they had their own weapons, so they wasn't sitting around scared, but they were the majority, but they still had no control over voting, registration, etc. But here in the middle of this moment, and in fact, the photograph is from a series of photos taken while for a magazine called Look Magazine back in the day. It's got pictures of Mr. Carmichael like bottle feeding a toddler while he's organizing, riding a donkey, just being in the community. And Lydia, I'll tell you, the thing that moved me so deeply was I said, in the middle of this, there was room for a young Black Power firebrand to sit holding hands with an old head who is not fooled. He knew Alabama better than Stokely did. But even if it was a sharecropper's shack, and it could have been, or it could have been his own land. We don't know. I don't really know that. I'm still researching. Here in the midst of this turmoil are these two brothers holding hands and smiling. For all I know, frankly, they could have been posing. I don't know. Doesn't matter. The moment was captured. And I get to write, as a rite of passage, person, to see that as a moment where the next day the elder is more courageous. So he talks to another elder, where Stokely is more inspired to go talk to somebody else, because it didn't change their goal. Even if they was frowning, they was gonna still be down there to do whatever they were there to do. But when I saw that photograph, I said, that's what I'm about. There is a role to fiddle while you're fighting. Fiddle with beauty, be beautiful, be courteous, be courageous, be gentle, be about pleasure, be about imagination, and still keep your eye on the nexus of power, racism, all the stuff, capitalism, whatever you're fighting, you don't lose sight of those things because you're doing it with style, with verve, and with celebration.
Yeah, that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Also, that is it. On the other hand, that's always what makes me chuckle a little bit when people are critiquing activists as or even the stereotypes that you're partially fighting is, the angry Black man, the angry Black woman is the reason. One of the main reasons we're so angry is because we just want more of those moments, those beautiful moments that are so easy. They're not, they're free for everyone. But all this crap gets in the way.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So that I love that.
Yeah.
That image.
Yeah, I like to say, look, I didn't create the Black codes. I didn't create slavery and have actual prices for people's hearts and livers and body parts. You know what I mean? I didn't create the fugitive slave laws. I didn't create the Patriot Act. You know what I mean? I haven't blown up anybody. I haven't stolen children from so-called tribes because I haven't stolen anybody's land. You know what I mean? As I said, I can't help when I'm born, but I'm very clear that I don't take the weight of, exploitative history. You know what I mean? My job is to point it out. I mean, it's like, you know what I mean? This whole idea is like somebody like Stephen Miller, whispering and not so whispering all that right-wing bullshit into Trump's and them ear, and you're arresting children, and you got a child sitting in a fucking courtroom, as if that really is a way to run a society. You know what I mean? I'm not the immigrant of mayhem. You know what I mean? This is what I say. So now, the woman kills the young man in his own apartment. She's the cop. She goes to court. The judge hugs her. I'm like, get the fuck out of here. You know what I mean? She shot the dude in his own crib. Put her in jail or do whatever restorative version of justice that gets built finally. But, you know, she don't need no hug just because she's a petite blonde woman. She killed a dude. If she wanted a hug, she should have said, "Oh, my bad, man," and not brought a gun into the dude's apartment. You know, so again, I think there is room. People like June Jordan and them were really good on this. You know, the black women in South Africa, you have struck a rock, bro. When it's time, you're supposed to, there's a time for rumbling and there's a time for righteous anger, and all of that. But the key message from the culture for me is that at its best, Black culture is a synthesizing culture. It's a sort of a all in all culture. That's what I mean by fiddling while you fight. So, or even when you're oppressed or you can ready to poison somebody in the kitchen, you might still be singing a spiritual, So again, it's really very serious to me. I take this stuff very seriously. It's not just a product. It's not Black joy. So yeah, I want to get my book published, of course, because that's what I do. I'm a writer, and I want my national publishing industry to see this as a valuable theme, and I want to see it out in the world on the, sort of getting getting the benefit of the promotional energies and synergies that can grow when there's resources involved. But really, I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do anyway. The book that you're in, and Mr. Chester Higgins is in it. Roy Lewis and the Chicano brothers, Noe Montez, and another dude in LA, Ediberto Oriol. These are master photographers. You guys are masters. You're living masters. So we're juxtaposing your current work or work that comes through your current practice with historical imagery. And then in this book, I'm also have a third section where I literally am just taking photos of my dad with his various children in different settings with poems that I've written. And I wanted to make it very intimate. And my father, I don't remember him as super, like I was much more physical with my children, holding their hands and stuff. But yet we found, magical photos of him as a father, and with his brothers and aunt and my aunt. So I just feel like it's important to demonstrate the thing that you say you stand for. And so I should be an energized, dynamic, curious, silly, serious, cultural worker if I'm going to represent this work, because this is how I feel doing it. I'm not afraid to be alive.
I love that. That's why I wanted to, I'm going to be talking to a lot of people about how to do what I'm trying to do. Mm-hmm. And I just felt like I needed to start with you and with this question of joy, because it's one of the most intense things, and it's so beautiful, and it is why we're all doing anything. So I really appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you, and I'm excited about what you got going there. And as I said, I read your beautiful year-end statement, and also the beautiful photo postcards that you shared. I mean, listen, I think that's the lesson to me, Lydia, to make sure we share with folks, is in the end, no matter whether you have a platform, quote unquote, or not, in the end, if you look at African-American history in particular, just in this journey in the States, nobody asked for permission. You know what I mean? So I'll get glib enough to say, so it's gonna be segregation. then cool. We're gonna create our whole multi-million-dollar empires, whether from hair to insurance to real estate to towns, everything. I mean, and we're going to fight back if we have, when you come calling in an incorrect way. You want to talk about cultural work. We're going to create whole, art forms. So I'm saying nobody's asking me to do happiness work. It's my job to make it irresistible, to make it beautiful. It's my job to stay available. When I mentioned Miss Kate earlier, she's like in her 20s. She just got her library degree. She's from a suburb. She actually, I promised I wouldn't say this much anymore, but I think it makes the point. Helen is had never done a project like this. She's a blonde, she's from one of the suburbs outside of Pasadena. But she says when she heard of this project, she got so hyped. Now, it doesn't mean she's not conscious, doesn't mean she wasn't well read and well experienced and all of that. I'm not suggesting that I converted her or anything like that. That's not my point. My point is that as a collaborator, if you see us standing next to each other, you might say, oh my God, how the hell did she get involved in a Black man, a happiness project? Well, she got involved because she was inspired. And inspiration, especially when it's broken down the way I kind of learned it, which was through this magical book called The Healers by a Ghanaian writer, Ayikwe Arma. He wrote 2000 Seasons, which is sort of the activist novel. But The Healers, is really about, it's just a murder mystery set in Africa. But there's a young man who's like out of sorts, out of time. And he goes to visit a healer who lives in the forest. And the healer tells him the difference between persuading people based on using inspiration versus manipulation. And I was so turned out by that internal, character-driven exchange that I sort of got it. And I realized that in the end, since I don't come to the table with billions of dollars or ownership of media properties, etc., what's my most powerful tool? Doing it well and standing with it, standing for it and standing with integrity so that it can connect with people beyond ideology, through cultural backgrounds, cultural phenotypes, etc. And in the end, I'm so thrilled to give Helen credit for her coinage of emanating essences. So in everything I write, she always gets credit because it's her turn of phrase. And it's a synergy. It's a symbiosis because she would have never thought of it necessarily if I didn't come to her at the library that time and she didn't get the assignment and she didn't begin her outreach. So this is what I mean by full participation. You don't know where the participation is going to spin you into. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. And you don't look for the product or the end or the victory. You look for the experience.
Perfect.
Yeah.